3 simple words changed everything, but it wasn't just what 8-year-old Timothy said that shattered two of America's most beloved icons. It was the timing, the innocence, and the devastating truth hidden behind those words that would leave Tom Hanks and Steve Harvey completely broken on live television. What happened next? Nobody could have prepared for the emotional avalanche that followed. Nobody in that packed Los Angeles studio could have predicted what was about to unfold. This wasn't supposed to happen. Tom Hanks was just making a surprise guest appearance on Family Feud, promoting his latest film. Steve Harvey was in his element, working the crowd with his signature blend of humor and charm. The atmosphere was electric, filled with laughter and the kind of wholesome entertainment America had come to expect. But sometimes life has other plans. Sometimes a single moment can expose the raw humanity beneath the celebrity facade, reminding us that even our heroes carry wounds too deep for cameras to capture. What you're about to read will change how you see these two men forever. Let me take you back to that Tuesday afternoon in Studio City. But first, you need to understand the invisible forces that brought these three souls together in one life-changing moment. The morning started like any other for Tom Hanks. He was staying at the Beverly Hills Hotel, having flown in from New York, where he'd been doing press interviews. His publicist had arranged this surprise appearance as a favor to the producers who had been requesting him for years. Tom had woken up earlier than usual that morning around 5 a.m., unable to sleep. He'd been having the dreams again, the ones about his father. They came sporadically, usually when he was stressed or facing major life decisions. In the dreams, he was always a young boy again, trying to get his father's attention, trying to make him proud. He'd wake up with a hollow feeling in his chest, a reminder of the relationship that was never quite what he'd hoped it would be. His father, Amos Hanks, had died in 1992, just as Tom's career was reaching new heights. They'd had a complicated relationship, not bad, exactly, but distant. Amos had been a chef, a practical man who didn't quite understand his son's artistic aspirations. When Tom won his first Oscar, his father was already gone. Unable to see his son reach the pinnacle of his profession, that absence haunted Tom more than he ever let on publicly. Meanwhile, across town in Burbank, Steve Harvey was going through his own morning ritual. He'd been hosting Family Feud for over a decade now, and the routine was second nature: coffee, prayer, review of the families, and a quick mental preparation for whatever curveballs the day might throw at him. But Steve had been carrying his own burden lately. It was coming up on the anniversary of his father Jesse's death, and he'd been thinking about him more than usual. Jesse Harvey had been a coal miner who worked multiple jobs to support his family. He died when Steve was struggling as a comedian, sleeping in his car and wondering if he'd ever make it. Jesse never got to see his son become a household name, never got to witness the empire Steve would build. The success felt hollow sometimes, knowing his father wasn't there to share it. And then there was Timothy Thompson, waking up in his grandmother's small apartment in Sacramento. His life had been turned upside down just 6 weeks earlier when his father, Marcus Thompson, had been killed in a car accident on his way home from work. Marcus had been a construction worker, a single father who'd been raising Timothy alone after his mother left when Timothy was just 3 years old. Timothy didn't fully understand what gone forever meant. He kept expecting his father to walk through the door, to ruffle his hair, and ask about his day. His grandmother, Dorothy, was doing her best to care for him, but she was 68 and struggling with her own grief. When Timothy's older sister, Sarah, had been selected for Family Feud, Dorothy had insisted Timothy come along. "The boy needs some joy in his life," she'd said, not knowing how prophetic those words would be. The Family Feud set was buzzing with an unusual energy that afternoon. Word had leaked that Tom Hanks would be making an unannounced appearance, and the studio audience was electric with anticipation. The production assistants were running around with nervous energy, making sure everything was perfect for their A-list guest. Steve Harvey had been hosting for over a decade, but even he seemed genuinely excited about this surprise. The Thompson family from Sacramento was facing off against the Martinez family from Phoenix. It was supposed to be a regular taping, Nothing out of the ordinary. Sarah Thompson, 19 years old and a college sophomore, was the designated player for her family. She'd brought Timothy along because their grandmother, who was supposed to watch him, had come down with the flu at the last minute. Timothy sat in the front row of the Thompson family section, barely visible behind the podium, wearing a crisp white button-down shirt that his grandmother had ironed specially for the occasion. The shirt had been his father's, taken in by a local seamstress to fit Timothy's small frame. He wore it because it still smelled faintly of his father's cologne, a connection to the man he missed with every breath. Timothy wasn't supposed to be there. Game show rules typically prohibited children his age from even being in the studio during taping, but the producers had made an exception when they learned about the family's recent tragedy. They thought it would be good for the boy to have some fun, to experience something joyful during such a dark time. Nobody expected him to say anything. Nobody expected him to even be noticed. But children have a way of surprising us, especially children who have been forced to grow up too fast, who have stared death in the face and somehow found the courage to keep living. Tom Hanks emerged from backstage to thunderous applause, that familiar warm smile lighting up his face as he waved to the crowd. He looked exactly like America expected him to look, confident, gracious, genuinely happy to be there. But those who knew him well might have noticed the slight tightness around his eyes, the way his smile didn't quite reach them. He was performing, as he always did, but underneath the performance was a man carrying invisible weight. Steve Harvey greeted him with characteristic enthusiasm, the two men sharing that easy camaraderie that made for great television. They'd met before at various industry events, but this was their first time working together, and the chemistry was immediate. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve announced, his voice booming across the studio, "we have the one and only Tom Hanks joining us today. Tom, what brings you to our Family Feud family?" Tom laughed, that signature laugh that had charmed audiences for decades. "Steve, I've been watching your show for years. I figured it was time I came down here and saw how the magic happens. Plus, I hear these families are pretty competitive. I wanted to see if I could learn something about winning from the best." The audience erupted in laughter and applause. Everything was going exactly as planned. The cameras were rolling, the energy was perfect, and two of America's most beloved entertainers were creating the kind of wholesome content that would make headlines for all the right reasons. Steve launched into his routine, asking Tom about his latest projects, making jokes about Tom's famous nice guy reputation. "Tom, is it true that you're actually this nice in real life, or is this all an act?" "Well, Steve," Tom replied with mock seriousness, "I save all my mean for the craft services table. You should see me fight over the last donut." The banter continued for several minutes, both men in their element playing off each other's energy. The families were laughing, the audience was engaged, and the producers in the booth were congratulating themselves on landing such a perfect guest. But then something unexpected happened. As Tom and Steve were bantering, making jokes about Tom's filmography and Steve's famous reactions, Timothy suddenly stood up from behind the Thompson family podium. His movement was small, quiet, but something about it caught the camera operator's attention. Timothy had been listening to the conversation, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about the last conversation he'd had with his father the night before the accident. They'd been watching TV together, and his father had pointed to Tom Hanks on the screen. "That's a good man," Marcus had said. "You can tell by his eyes. He's got kind eyes, like someone who understands what it means to hurt but keeps being kind anyway." Timothy had asked his father how he could tell such things just by looking, and Marcus had smiled that sad smile he'd been wearing more often lately. "When you've lost people you love, son, you learn to recognize the same loss in others. It's like we all carry little pieces of sadness that make us more gentle with the world." Now, looking at Tom Hanks on the stage, Timothy saw what his father had seen. Behind the laughter and the jokes, there was something familiar in Tom's eyes. It was the same look Timothy had started seeing in his own reflection since his father died, the look of someone trying to be brave while missing someone important. "Excuse me," Timothy called out, his young voice cutting through the adult conversation with startling clarity. The studio fell quiet so suddenly that it felt like someone had pressed a mute button on the world. Steve and Tom both turned, surprised. All eyes focused on this tiny figure in the crisp white shirt. Steve, always professional, automatically shifted into his gentle tone reserved for the youngest audience members. "Yes, sweetheart. What's your name?" "Timothy," the boy replied, his voice steady despite being the center of attention in a room full of hundreds of people. "Timothy Thompson. I have a question." Tom Hanks, ever the professional, smiled warmly at the child. There was something about the boy's serious expression that caught his attention. "Well, Timothy Thompson, I'd be happy to answer any question you have." The studio was still quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that happens when people sense something important is about to occur. Timothy looked directly at Tom Hanks with those wide, innocent eyes that only children possess and asked a question that nobody saw coming. "Mr. Hanks," Timothy said, his voice carrying across the silent studio with perfect clarity, "do you miss your daddy too?" The words hung in the air like a physical presence, dense with meaning and pain. Tom Hanks' smile froze on his face, then slowly began to crumble. Steve Harvey stopped mid-gesture, his hand suspended in the air as he processed what he'd just heard. The studio audience, sensing something profound was happening, fell into a respectful silence that was almost sacred. But Timothy wasn't finished. With the brutal honesty that only children possess, the honesty that cuts through pretense and reaches straight for truth, he continued, "My daddy went to heaven last month, and my mom cries every night. She thinks I don't know, but I hear her through the walls. She tries to be quiet, but crying is loud even when you whisper it." The boy paused, gathering courage for what came next. "Do you think our daddies can see us on TV? Do you think they know we're trying to be brave?" The question hit both men like a physical blow, like someone had reached into their chests and grabbed their hearts. Tom Hanks, who had built a career on portraying strength and reliability, who had become America's dad on screen precisely because he projected such steady comfort, felt his composure completely crumble. His father, Amos, had died when Tom was 36, just as his career was reaching new heights. They'd had a complicated relationship. Not bad, exactly, but distant. Amos had been a practical man, a chef who worked multiple jobs, and didn't quite understand his son's artistic aspirations. When Tom won his first Oscar, his father was already gone, unable to see his son reach the pinnacle of his profession. That absence haunted Tom more than he ever let on publicly. Steve Harvey, who had lost his own father Jesse years earlier, felt his throat tighten with familiar pain. Jesse had been a coal miner who worked multiple jobs to support his family. He died when Steve was still struggling as a comedian, sleeping in his car and wondering if he'd ever make it. Jesse never got to see his son become a household name, never got to witness the empire Steve would build. Here was this innocent child, carrying a grief too heavy for his small shoulders, asking the questions that both men had wrestled with in their darkest moments. Questions about whether their success meant anything if their fathers couldn't see it. Questions about whether love survives death. Questions about whether they were honoring or disappointing the men who had shaped them. Tom Hanks tried to speak, but found he couldn't. His voice caught in his throat as tears began streaming down his face. This wasn't the composed, camera-ready response of a seasoned actor. This was raw, unfiltered emotion from a man who was suddenly an 8-year-old boy again, missing his father and wondering if he was proud. Steve Harvey, who had made a career out of always having the right words, who could handle any situation with humor or wisdom, found himself equally speechless. He looked at Timothy, then at Tom, then back at Timothy, and for the first time in his hosting career, he didn't know what to say. The cameras kept rolling, but this was no longer entertainment. This was humanity at its most vulnerable. Two successful men being reminded of their deepest pain by a child who was just beginning to understand his own. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. In the control room, producers were frantically whispering about whether to cut to commercial, whether to stop taping, whether this was still television or had become something else entirely. Tom Hanks finally found his voice, but it was broken and thick with emotion. "Timothy," he whispered, "I think about my dad every single day. Every morning when I wake up, every night before I go to sleep. And you know what? I think he can see everything I do. I think your daddy can see you too. And I think he's so proud of the brave little boy you are." Timothy nodded solemnly, processing this information with the seriousness that only children facing adult realities can muster. "Do you think he knows I try to be good when mommy cries? Do you think he knows I don't cry in front of her because it makes her sadder?" That question, the image of this little boy swallowing his own grief to protect his mother's feelings, broke something inside both men completely. Steve Harvey, who had been struggling to maintain his composure, finally surrendered to the emotion. Tears began flowing freely down his face as he knelt down to Timothy's level. "Son," Steve said, his voice cracking with emotion, "your daddy knows everything. He knows how good you are, how much you love your mama, and how brave you're being. And somewhere up there, he's probably telling my daddy and Mr. Hank's daddy all about what a special little boy you are." The studio audience was openly weeping now. Camera operators wiped their eyes while trying to keep filming. Even the hardened production crew, people who had seen every possible scenario unfold on television, found themselves reaching for tissues and trying to maintain their professional composure. In the control room, the executive producer made a decision that would define the rest of his career. Instead of cutting to commercial, instead of trying to salvage the entertainment value of the show, he quietly told his crew to keep rolling. "This is bigger than our show," he whispered into his headset. "This is something people need to see." What happened next transformed this moment from heartbreaking to healing, from a child's pain to a universal truth about love and loss. Tom Hanks, still crying but finding strength in this child's innocence, walked over to Timothy and knelt down beside Steve. The image was powerful. Two of America's most successful men, kneeling on a game show stage, brought to their knees by the simple honesty of a grieving child. "Timothy," Tom said, his voice steady despite his tears, "can I tell you something my dad taught me before he went to heaven?" Timothy nodded, his wide eyes fixed on Tom's face with complete trust. "He told me that love doesn't die when someone goes to heaven, it just changes form. Every time you help your mom, every time you're brave, every time you're kind to someone, that's your daddy's love working through you. You're not just Timothy anymore. You're Timothy carrying his daddy's love, and that makes you extra special." Steve Harvey, witnessing this exchange, felt something shift inside him. Here was Tom Hanks, one of the most successful actors in Hollywood, being more real than he'd ever been on camera. And here was this little boy carrying adult pain with childlike faith, teaching both men something about resilience and hope. "You know what, Timothy," Steve said, his voice growing stronger. "I think our daddy sent you here today to remind us grown-ups about what really matters. I think this wasn't an accident. I think you were meant to be here to ask us that question." Timothy considered this seriously, his 8-year-old mind working through concepts that many adults never fully grasp. Then he smiled for the first time since he'd started speaking. Not a fake smile or a polite smile, but a real one, the kind that transforms a face completely. "Do you think they're friends now? In heaven? Do you think they watch us together?" Tom and Steve looked at each other, both men still emotional but finding comfort in this child's simple faith, in his ability to imagine heaven as a place where fathers compare notes about their children. "I think they're best friends," Tom replied, "and I think they're watching us right now, probably telling each other how lucky they are to have such amazing kids." What followed was unlike anything that had ever happened on a game show or perhaps on television at all. The competition was forgotten. The rules were abandoned. The Thompson and Martinez families, competitors just moments before, came together in the center of the stage, surrounding Timothy with love and support. Steve Harvey made a decision that defied every television protocol, every piece of industry wisdom about maintaining pace and energy. He stopped the show entirely and turned the moment into something unprecedented, a celebration of Timothy's father's life and a testament to the power of love transcending death. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve announced to the studio audience, his voice thick with emotion but strong with purpose, "we're going to do something different today. We're going to take a moment to honor Timothy's daddy and all the daddies who are watching over us from heaven." Tom Hanks stood up and addressed the audience directly. I want to tell you all something. In 30 years of making movies, I've never felt more honored to be anywhere than I do right here, right now with this brave little boy." He turned back to Timothy. "What was your daddy's name, son?" "Marcus," Timothy replied. "Marcus Thompson. He built houses? He said he was making homes for families, and that was the most important job in the world." Tom nodded, clearly moved. "Marcus Thompson sounds like he was a wonderful man. Would you like to tell us about him?" And so Timothy did. Standing there in the middle of the Family Feud stage, surrounded by cameras and lights, and strangers who had become friends, he told them about his father. He told them about how Marcus would make pancakes on Sunday mornings, cutting them into funny shapes that made Timothy laugh. He told them about how his father would read to him every night, doing different voices for all the characters. He was scared of spiders, Timothy said, which made everyone laugh through their tears, but he would catch them and put them outside instead of killing them, because he said every living thing deserved a chance. As Timothy spoke, something magical happened. The studio audience, initially there for entertainment, became part of something much more meaningful. People began sharing their own stories. An elderly woman in the third row stood up and talked about her husband, who had passed. A young man in the back shared memories of his grandfather. Steve Harvey, recognizing the profound nature of what was happening, made another unprecedented decision. He invited audience members to come forward and share their stories of loss and love. For the next hour, the Family Feud stage became something like a community gathering, a place where grief was shared and love was celebrated. Tom Hanks shared stories about his own father, speaking with a vulnerability that audiences had never seen from him.
"My dad wasn't perfect,"
Tom said, his arm around Timothy's shoulders. "We didn't always understand each other, but I know he loved me, and I know he wanted me to be happy. That's what all good fathers want for their children." Steve talked about the lessons his father had taught him about perseverance and faith. "My daddy died before he could see any of this," Steve said, gesturing to the cameras and the stage. "But I know he's watching now, and I know he's proud. Not because I'm on TV, but because I'm trying to use whatever platform I have to spread love and laughter." And Timothy, with the wisdom that sometimes comes from pain, helped two grown men remember that grief shared is grief lessened, that love multiplied is never diminished. The episode, when it finally aired 3 months later, was unlike anything television had ever broadcast. The producers had to edit carefully, trying to capture the emotional journey without exploiting it. They included a disclaimer at the beginning, explaining that viewers were about to witness something unscripted and deeply personal. It became one of the most watched episodes in Family Feud history, but more importantly, it sparked a national conversation about grief, healing, and the power of unexpected connections. Timothy's question, "Do you miss your daddy too?" became a rallying cry for others dealing with loss. Support groups across the country adopted it as a way to open conversations. Therapists used it with clients who were struggling to express their grief. Fathers called their children after watching the episode, telling them they loved them. People shared their own stories of loss and healing on social media, using the hashtag #DoYouMissToo. Tom Hanks later said in interviews that Timothy's question fundamentally changed his perspective on fame and success. "This little boy reminded me that beneath all the accolades and achievements, we're all just people missing the ones we love. There's something beautifully human about that vulnerability, something that connects us all." He established a scholarship fund in Marcus Thompson's name, designed to help children who had lost parents continue their education. But more importantly, Tom stayed in touch with Timothy, becoming a mentor and father figure during the boy's most crucial developmental years. Steve Harvey incorporated Timothy's story into his motivational speaking, often saying, "Sometimes wisdom comes from the most unexpected sources. An 8-year-old boy taught me more about healing in one afternoon than years of therapy ever had." Steve also made changes to his show, creating regular segments where families could honor loved ones who had passed away. "Timothy showed me that television at its best isn't about entertainment," Steve explained. "It's about connection. It's about reminding people that they're not alone." But perhaps the most powerful outcome was what happened to Timothy himself. The outpouring of love and support following the episode helped his family through their darkest period. Timothy's mother, who had been struggling with depression since her husband's death, found strength in the community that had formed around her son's courage. The family received thousands of letters from people who had been touched by Timothy's story. A local construction company, inspired by Marcus's profession, offered to help Timothy's mother with a down payment on a house. A scholarship fund was established for Timothy's education, ensuring that his father's dream of providing opportunities for his children would be fulfilled. Today, Timothy is a teenager, thriving in school and carrying forward the legacy of love his father left behind. He volunteers at a local hospice, helping other children who are dealing with loss. He still watches that episode sometimes, remembering the day when two famous men cried with him and taught him that grief, when shared, becomes something beautiful. The lesson that an 8-year-old boy taught two of America's most beloved figures is simple but profound. We're all just people missing someone we love, and sometimes, in our most vulnerable moments, we discover that our pain connects us to others in ways that our successes never could. Tom Hanks and Steve Harvey learned something that day that changed how they approached their careers and their lives. They learned that sometimes the most powerful moments happen when we stop performing and start being human. Timothy taught them that strength isn't about never crying, it's about being brave enough to cry together. The microphones that captured Timothy's simple question also captured something rare in our celebrity-obsessed culture. The moment when fame fell away and 3 human beings, 2 men and a boy, found healing in shared grief and unexpected love. In a world that often feels divided, that episode reminded millions of viewers that grief is a universal language, that love transcends death, and that sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest truths. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story of Timothy's courage and the day he taught 2 icons what really matters is never forgotten, because sometimes asking, "Do you miss your daddy too?" is the bravest thing anyone can do, and sometimes the answer can heal hearts we didn't even know were broken.